Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. We ready to go? Okay. Thanks for coming. This is the first program for the fall semester of the Assembly Series. If you don't know what that is, it's the university's premier series, so welcome. And if you'd like to know the rest of the 10 programs that we have going on through mid-November, we've got plenty of schedules in the back there. We also have Frankenstein bookmarks and stuff on lots of different things. There's a Washington University's Safety and Security Department has tons of stuff back there, especially for students, for where to go in an emergency, that sort of thing. So, if you're a student, check that out, or a parent of a student, check that out. Just very, very, very quickly, I just want to say we don't have anything official after this event, but the 3 participants are going to stay around. So if you didn't get your question answered, or if you just want to say hi, come on up. Nick's he got in at 11 o'clock last night. Poor guy, he's a real trooper, so he's fine, but jet lag. So anyway, come on up and say hi. Finally, I just want to say, please turn off all electronic devices. And we'll be out in a minute.
What's extraordinary about working on it is that you realise it's timeless. It will be here a long time after we're all gone, because it swims into focus depending on different issues, either in a very specific way like genetics or cloning, or in a very, very general way really about, what man is capable of and what are the repercussions of that.
In writer Nick Dear's adaptation, the creature, rather than the scientist Victor Frankenstein, is given the central role. The production becomes the creature's story and begins with him being literally born on stage.
The idea was to start with the innocence of the child being born. It opened up the whole world because it stripped you of the creature being a monster. Now, a monster is something that frightens you, that's out there. And in fact, what you do by making him a creature is you're saying he's you. He's just like you. And that was the emphasis at the beginning of the production, was to see him recognise things that we go, and the bird song and the rain and all the different things that the sensations of childhood. And that gives a wonderful innocence and simpleness really to the beginning of such a complicated idea of creating a human being.
By exploring the idea of artificial life, Mary Shelley raised larger questions about our own origins and mankind's place in the universe.
I think Mary Shelley was writing almost without appreciating it, a sort of creation myth for the science age. In many cultures there are creation myths, but they always involve a deity, a cosmic power. Something sets the spark of life in motion and we humans come to life. The first time Mary Shelley comes up with a creation myth which doesn't involve a deity, doesn't involve cosmic power, it involves solely the skills of humankind. And that's why I think it stays with us now, because God doesn't play a very big part in our rationalization about the world we live in and what we're going to do with it and the extent to which we're destroying it, as we patently are. Mary Shelley's a very highly educated young 18, 19-year-old woman when she comes to it. And the book is stuffed full of ideas which seem to me to remain very pertinent to us now.
Remember, I am your creature. I ought to be your Adam, but I am the fallen angel whom you drove from joy for no misdeed.
I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Welcome to the question, which one is the monster? My name is Rebecca Messbarger. I'm a professor of Italian in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures and director of the Medical Humanities program. Joining me on the stage is my wonderful colleague, Henry Schvey, who is a professor of drama and comparative literature, and for 20 years was the chair of the Performing Arts Department. I will introduce our guest of honor in just a moment. Today's Common Reading program is part of a university-wide celebration of the bicentennial of Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein. There will be numerous events across the campus and all the way through the fall of 2018, and I would encourage you to look at the Frankenstein Bicentennial website in order to find out what's coming. Today's conversation is sponsored by the First Year Center, and we are very grateful to Jill Stratton and her entire First Year Center team for their invaluable assistance in developing this event, and to our campus partners for their wonderful support: the School of Law, the Washington University Political Review, and the Assembly series directed by Barbara Ray. So it's especially wonderful to look out and see so many young faces of our students, many of whom have just arrived for their first year at Washington University. I know in the orientation to this novel you have heard over and over that you are the very age of Mary Shelley, when 200 years ago she wrote the defining creation myth and horror story of the modern age. No pressure. Students who have already successfully channeled their inner Shelley are winners of the Common Reading Program contest. And I would ask these students to rise so we can recognize their terrific work. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all the members of our audience for coming out for what promises to be, I have to say it, an electrifying conversation with the acclaimed playwright Nick Dear about the novel and his gorgeous stage adaptation of it. So Nick Dear's interest in theater also began during his undergraduate years at university in Essex. And it was there that he was cast in what he has called a career-defining role: second murderer in Macbeth. The experience confirmed that he would not pursue a career in acting, but by the end of his undergraduate studies, he had already written his first play. Mr. Dear's full-time career as playwright launched with the production of The Art of Success in 1986 at the Royal Shakespeare Company at Stratford-upon-Avon. It won international acclaim and was staged 2 years later in New York City with Tim Curry of Rocky Horror Picture Shame fame in the lead role. Notably, the play came here 25 years ago and was put on in our Performing Arts Department. Since that time, Mr. Dear has written dozens of plays, including his award-winning The Dark Earth and the Light Sky, and numerous celebrated adaptations, among which are Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, and of course, Frankenstein. He has also written many acclaimed screenplays for television and film, as well as popular radio plays produced for the BBC. As we saw in the video, his 2011 adaptation of Frankenstein was directed by Danny Boyle and featured Benedict Cumberbatch and Johnny Lee Miller at the National Theatre of London, whose simulcast screenings have been seen by millions of people worldwide, including, I'm sure, many of you. So please join me in welcoming our guest, Nick Dear.
Welcome, everyone. I want to begin by raising a question, and we're going to be doing this in a kind of conversational form, and then at the end we'll be opening the floor for questions to you. And I was going to ask Nick about the process of adaptation, but before we do, I think perhaps a prologue is in order, in which you might want to address how you came to view this novel.
Well, first of all, I'll say what a pleasure it is to be here, a long way from my home in London, England. Delighted to find that 1,746 of your first-year intake, i.e. all of them, have read this book from cover to cover, and I'm reassured that they're not actually lying, they have read it. I've been in a brief conversation before coming in here with the competition winners, and I can tell you that the level of intellect that's going around is quite something. So very impressive, and a great idea to use this novel as an interdisciplinary basis for your entire first year intake, because one can approach it from so many different ways. When I first came to it, which was quite a long time ago now, I was very intrigued by who was this Mary Shelley. You know, one had heard of Byron and Shelley. Who is Mary Shelley? I mean, possibly some of you know her story, but in brief, let me tell you. Her mother is Mary Wollstonecraft, often called the mother of feminism, the author of the first, one would say, feminist book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And her father was a radical philosopher, William Godwin. This is in the 1790s in London. And Mary, they married a few months before Mary was born, but Mary Wollstonecraft died due to complications in childbirth 11 days after Mary Shelley was born. So Mary Shelley does not know her mother, which I think is quite significant for this novel. Mary grows up they didn't have much money, but they were at the center of radical debates in London around about 1800. When Mary Shelley's 8 years old, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great romantic poet, comes and reads his new poem in her living room. It's called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And she hides behind the sofa so she can listen because she's supposed to be in bed. That's the world she's growing up in. When she's 16, somebody else comes into their orbit, and that's the poet Percy Shelley, who is 20. She's 16, he's 20. He's already married to Harriet. They have one child. Shelley is a mad genius poet, and at this time a radical reformer who's trying very hard to change the world. He's running around the British Isles distributing leaflets to the workers who don't really want to know. Mary thinks he's just wonderful, and they elope. Shelley leaves. He abandons his first wife, Harriet, and subsequently 2 children. Harriet kills herself not long afterwards, which is a blot on Mary's history ever since. But significantly, they have to get out of the country more than once. And on their second trip abroad, they find themselves visiting Lord Byron on the shores of Lake Geneva. And probably many of you know the famous story of how they sit around one night, Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and the Dr. Polidori, and say, we should write ghost stories. The weather's terrible because there's been a volcanic eruption in somewhere like Sumatra that year. And they have 2 years of terrible harvest. So they've got terrible weather. They're sitting indoors going, what should we do with ourselves? None of them succeed in completing their ghost story, apart from Mary Shelley, who is 18 years old. And over the next year or so, she completes Frankenstein. An absolutely extraordinary achievement for a woman of that, for anybody, but particularly for a woman of that age. But I think it is important that we understand where it's coming. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It comes out of this background. She grows up in a world in which debate is encouraged, new ideas are encouraged. She and Percy Shelley are fascinated by the new world of science and chemistry particularly, and galvanism and electricity, and all these things are just starting. And we know that they would go to lectures in London on voltaic piles and battery cells. They're fascinated by this. All of this informs Frankenstein.
That's splendid. We will continue to go to dig, as it were. I'm going to ask a number of questions, and so is Rebecca, and we'll present them to Nick, and we'll continue with our discussion. So my first one is this. I can't help but think that there is a perhaps rather crude comparison between what Victor Frankenstein does in harvesting dead body parts and finding a way to reanimate them with the job of the playwright, the adaptive playwright, cutting Mary Shelley's early 19th century text and transforming it and giving it life in the 21st century. You cut an enormous amount out of the novel, and yet the result is completely convincing. How did you decide what it was to cut and what to include from the original text?
Well, let me step back just slightly and say that, as we all know, there are an awful lot of movies on the subject of Frankenstein. I believe there are around 200. And I've seen a number of them. I'd never seen, even though I live in London, as I say, and I live in in the centre of a theatre culture. We have a lot of plays going on. I'd never seen a version of Frankenstein on the stage that I thought was any good or was in any way serious. Like there was a gap in the market. I mean, one of my reasons for coming to this is, as a professional writer, I'm going, no one's done that. Maybe that's a good idea. But I began with the notion that, for those of you who have read it, which means everybody under 20, I don't think anybody else has, I'm sure many of you have read it, you may well know that there's a great central section of the novel, it's about 45 pages long, in which the creature, as I call him, and indeed as Mary Shelley calls him, she almost never refers to him as the monster. He's known as the creature, which is a much more, I would say, humane epithet. So I decided to use that, and I call him the creature throughout. He has about 45 pages in which he tells us his story. This is what happened to me. This is what it was like for me. And almost the entirety of our the catalogue of adaptations of this novel have been viewed principally from the point of view of the scientist, Victor Frankenstein. As I'm sure everybody knows, the creature is not called Frankenstein. His creator is called Frankenstein. And I thought, this is very odd. Why has this happened? We've got the great central section of the book is the creature's point of view, yet we never hear this, and the movies have never addressed it. Kenneth Branagh attempted to a little bit in his rather tragic 1994 outing, but by and large this has never been done. So my initial starting point was, okay, I'm going to try and tell at least part of the story from the point of view of the creature. And once you make that decision, a lot of other decisions start to fall into place. Mm-hmm. So you're beginning with, and I should say, I worked on this for a number of years. It didn't happen overnight. Some plays come along quite quickly. This one developed very much in collaboration with Danny Boyle, who you saw on the screen there. We spent a good few years going back and forth over this, with me drafting it and redrafting it and redrafting it. He'd go off and win a few more Oscars and come back, and I'd be sitting at home redrafting the play, and then he'd go and win a few more Oscars, and eventually we did it. But we knew that we had to look at the structure with that starting point in mind, which is we want the creature to tell his story. So immediately one is losing, for example, for those who know it, the sea captain's story, which bookends the novel. Captain Walton is going off on a voyage of discovery, trying to find the Northwest Passage over the Arctic, and he finds the dying Victor Frankenstein on an ice floe, somewhat unbelievably. I should say that an awful lot of the narrative devices in this novel are really terrible. I have heard it described as the worst great novel ever written. She's 18. I mean, a lot of it is just unspeakably bad. But at the heart of it is this incredible story, which to me was just ripe for dramatization, which is about the conflict, as we eventually get to, between the scientist and his experiment. And the experiment fights back and says, but you abandoned me. that's just the beginning of, how do you decide what to cut? Well, if you want to tell the story from the creature's point of view, which I don't keep strictly to that rule, about midway through, I have to bring in Victor. But I can't use the sea captain, and there are other reasons why I didn't. I want to tell simply what the creature has to say until I bring in Victor, and then I want to know something about how Victor came to achieve this extraordinary thing, the creation of life. And of course, when you start to look at it very closely, and when you start to struggle with how you make an adaptation, and when you sit in the rehearsal room with actors, whatever, they go, well, how does he do it? What actually happens? And you plumb the text and you go through it with a fine tooth comb, trying to find out what actually happens. And you realise that she can't tell us what actually happens because she doesn't know, because it's a fairy tale. It's not a truthful story, in the sense that she can't tell us, and I can't tell you, how Victor creates life. And I have to then give some backstory for Victor, which I did in a scene using the ghost of his little brother William.
Yes.
So carrying on with your focus on the creature, I'm wondering if you would talk about the real sin of Victor Frankenstein. So many people have said that his greatest crime was this unnatural birth, and I'm wondering if you think what you think about the notion of it's the fact that he didn't nurture what he created, and how that figures into Mary Shelley's understanding of what it means to be human and our need for affiliation.
When we were preparing this play at the National Theatre in London, one of the things that kept coming up in conversation, because we had a long rehearsal period of something like 6 or 7 weeks, and so you have a lot of conversations with people who are getting very involved in it. And the thing that kept coming up is, hang on, we're not trying to express what it's like to be a monster here. We're trying to express what it's like to be a human. What does it really mean to be a human? And I think that Mary Shelley, almost without knowing it, is addressing something really fundamental about care and nurture. But I think there's another side to it, which is we can say that the problems all begin with Victor's hubris. Mm-hmm. Victor is very proud of his ability. He's portrayed as an extraordinary genius, probably modelled on Percy Shelley, Mary's husband. An extraordinary wayward genius with no real social conscience and no real care for those about him in a personal, familial way. So I think a lot of it is about his derogation of duty when it comes to the care of his offspring, but it also even goes back before that to he makes a decision that he wants to have a child, effectively. He wants to create life, but he doesn't propose to do it by the normal route, which I won't have to explain to you because you all know what it is. So his wife, the woman who wants to be his wife, Elizabeth, who is often in adaptation of this story, they try and make Elizabeth into a sort of Mary Shelley figure, i.e. make her a bit feisty and feminist and adventurous and tricky. Well, she's not in the book. She's a bit of a blob. Her ambitions are entirely bourgeois. Her ambition is to be the wife who sits at home and has 6 children, and the husband comes back and sits by the fire with her. That's all she wants. Nice family life. Victor won't go there. Victor wants to create life effectively in a test tube. So there is an argument, possibly one that's now somewhat out of date, that the natural order of things has been thrown into chaos by his refusal to go through the normal sexual procreative functions. So I think the combination of his hubris as a scientist, believing he can do anything, and let's not forget that his ambition as a scientist is entirely laudable. He wants to eradicate disease. He wants to effectively get rid of death. He's saying, I can improve humankind. I'm that good. And I can do it by building, actually making life, building a creature from scratch. And he succeeds in this fairy tale. But one could argue that that's transgressive. that's not helpful to humankind. One could also argue that having done this, he then abandons his offspring. And you could also argue that the natural order is subverted and chaos will therefore ensue, if you liked.
I'm wondering if I could follow up. So you chose very young Benedict Cumberbatch and John Lee Miller. And I think what's striking is how young the Victor Frankenstein is, who you've represented in your play. But actually, he's a very young man in the novel. And it's often forgotten, right?
The novel is completely explicit. He's a postgrad student. He should be about 26. We, in the end, had to cast a couple of actors who were a little bit older. They were in their 30s. But I initially wanted to try and cast actors in their 20s. In almost all the movies, certainly the old movies, he's this rather camp gentleman in his 50s with long side whiskers, usually, and a rather mad giggle. But this has got nothing to do with Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley is proposing the brightest mind of his generation. It's like Allen Ginsberg, the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. She's got her sights on Percy Shelley, her husband. She's also got her sights on Lord Byron, whom she knows quite well by this time, who is sometimes seen as the model for the creature because he had a deformed leg and behaved like a monster most of the time. But I don't know. So
the reason I brought up the age of these young men is because, Mary Shelley seems to have a lot to say about education, about good teachers, about good students. These are, Victor Frankenstein is a young man just out of college or in the midst of college. And I'm just wondering, in the context, at the center of Washington University, in this top-tier school in the country, in the world, what do you think her message is about the limits and the aims of knowledge?
Well, I think there's one thing we should remind ourselves of, first of all, which is that we're very fortunate, at least in the West, that young ladies can go to college, as Mary Shelley couldn't. This was not possible. It didn't exist. There was no college for Mary Shelley. There was no education for Mary Shelley. There was no education for her mother. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a reformer trying to... She ran a couple of schools for young ladies, trying to actually find a place in which young women could be educated with something more than embroidery. But there was no possibility for Mary Shelley to go to college, and she is an autodidact, and her learning in the novel is kind of scattergun. It comes from all over the place, and as I said before, some of her narrative devices are a little bit wobbly, particularly the one, I think, in which the creature finds a satchel, which by pure chance contains the three texts which are central to Mary Shelley's thinking at the time, which are Plutarch, Milton, and Goethe's Life of Sorrows of Young Werther. Goethe. And it's a really naff, as we would say in England, a naff piece of script writing to suddenly come across a satchel. So I dumped that, and I have the blind man De Lacy takes over as the educator. And one of my ambitions in terms of writing a play of 2 hours length was that I wanted to start with a leading character who was quite literally inarticulate, who could not speak at all. And I wanted to take him through very quickly, within a 2-hour span, through the process of being educated, and end with him being the most articulate person on the stage.
I think that's... it was amazing to me in reading the adaptation that you were able to create a kind of verisimilitude about the creature's acquisition of language. After all, we've read the novel, and most of us don't learn sitting outside the De Lacy hovel or whatever it is. But this creature's acquisition of more than knowledge, of course, humanity feels justified and feels somehow that it's possible. I also love the device where in order to, when he leaves the creature alone, that Victor throws his cloak over him. And that cloak furnishes him in the next scene. And it's also where I think he finds the notebook. And those things seem very plausible, even though they're obviously theatrical devices. My question, next question, excuse me, is about the idea of corruption of innocence in the book. To what extent did you begin thinking that the creature is a creature who is born, as we all are, as a child, as a blank slate, and his purity, there's a desire to learn, which is cultivated in the DeLacy scene, which is then squandered by what he experiences through society and through understanding the origins of his birth.
I think it's perhaps valuable to just remember for a moment what I started off with, which is the world that she's coming from. This sudden outburst of radical debate, significantly coming immediately after the French Revolution. To most people in England, the French Revolution was a diabolical outrage. To a small handful of free thinkers, we'd probably call them, it was the best thing that ever happened anywhere, because suddenly all the old certainties are up for grabs. In the space of, 30, 40 years, all the precepts of Christianity are being questioned. Godwin, Mary's father, is saying, is marriage a good thing? No, I don't think it is. Is the church a good thing? I don't think it is. Should we have a monarchy? No, I don't think we should. It's all being questioned. And I think one of the most significant questions that is raised at that point is around the idea of original sin. It's around the idea of the Christian precept that we are born essentially evil. Rousseau, of course, comes along shortly before the French Revolution challenging this. And I'm not an academic expert like these wonderful people. I'm just a playwright. So if I get some of this wrong, don't blame me. I haven't spent my life devouring all the texts, but I know that one of the essences of Rousseau was he questions this notion of original sin and says, no, man is born free. That man is born simple, man meaning humankind, obviously. And I think Mary takes on this notion very deliberately, and I think it runs right through the book. And I think that there's no question that the book ends up saying evil is a product of social conditions. Mm-hmm. One could argue that's almost Marxist in its modernity. It's certainly not a standard way of thinking about evil in the late 18th century. I think she was. I don't think she knew what she was doing in one sense, and many commentators have said this about this book. That her later books are nothing like as interesting. They are interesting, but only really to scholars of early feminist literature. They're not great, and it's almost like she doesn't know what she's doing. It's all coming out of this kind of undercurrent of almost bubbling, crazy ideas going on that explode out of her over a year of writing this book. And one of them is, well, hang on, what if we're actually born perfect and corrupted by society? At that time, a very radical idea.
I think you're absolutely right, though. The fact that she sets it in Geneva, which is, a center of Calvinism, yeah. And it was the refuge of Rousseau. It seems as though those two things are at war in her novel, and there's a deliberateness in setting it in that city. So I think you're
agreed.
Absolutely right. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the critique of the Enlightenment that is going on. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the poetics of darkness and light in your play, that it's so exquisitely represented in that birth scene. We saw a tiny snippet of it in the video, in which the creature is being born to the electrical jolts that are lighting up the stage, but then we realize that it's actually his blinking eyes opening. And through the entire play, we have this contest between darkness and light, dark spaces of the laboratory, the dark moments looking, and dark agents and light agents as well. And I'm wondering if this is connected to philosophical questions. I'm an Enlightenment scholar, so I'm thinking about her critique of Enlightenment science, galvanism itself.
What does Victor say? That I brought torrents of light to a darkening world.
Right.
Exactly. That's a line that's in my play, which is actually in the book, and quite rare. The significance of the opening moments of the play that I wrote are that the stage goes dark, then it gets light, then it goes dark, and you realize that as the creature is opening, we see him being born. We see a baby being born, though he's a full-sized man.
From within.
Yeah. But the fact that, and I hasten to add that when Rebecca says there are electrical sparks, I'm not talking about lightning bolts or anything like that. None of that's going on. We're talking about something which is not represented on the stage, but it's hinted at, which is much more scientific and genuinely rooted in the science of the day. What it does, though, is it immediately says to the audience, and this is just pure dramaturgy, and this is like the nuts and bolts of playwriting, which is actually the main part of my answer to your question, which I'm coming to, is that it immediately says to the audience, okay, we're seeing things from his point of view. If the stage goes dark when the creature shuts his eyes and then it comes light again, you go, we're inside his head. So from the very beginning of my version of the story, which is an attempt only to do as I see it, do the greatest justice I can to Mary Shelley's extraordinary book, we are with the creature. Now, as for other shades of dark and light, it's no coincidence that Mary Shelley references Milton's Paradise Lost quite a lot in the novel, and I've pulled that out, kind of extracted that and brought it to the surface and made it a central motif for my creature, that he's learnt Paradise Lost off by heart, and the biblical story which Milton takes us through is shot through with ideas of a celestial light and a terrible darkness and so on. I didn't, but to try and answer your question properly, I didn't actually ever really see what I was doing as commenting in any way on the philosophy of the Enlightenment. I'm thinking much more about how does it look on a stage.
Oh, that's great.
I've had a dark scene there, so I'd like a light, so I've had a heavy scene there. So, for instance, I have a deliberately rather coarse, not perhaps great comedy sequence with two gravediggers on a Scottish island when Victor goes off to build a female, quite deliberately and modelled entirely on the Porter scene in Macbeth, where you've had a lot of, a very heavy stuff and you want a little bit of lightness. And there's another character who doesn't really figure in the book, Clarice, who's the maid of Elizabeth. I've made her into a slightly comic character, so when you talk about dark and light, I think you see probably you see it in a different way than I do, because I see it in terms of stage pictures and in terms of what's the story doing in terms of dark and light. But it's of course it's all linked, but I wouldn't say I ever approach it going, what have I got to say about the philosophy of the Enlightenment? I think that's what scholars do. I don't think it's what I do.
Right. But it does come through this contest and the relationship to her struggle with these philosophical concepts and the new science that she's confronted with and its impact. I did want to ask you about the relevance of her work for our contemporary understanding of science and humanity.
Well, I'm glad you said and humanity, because I think it goes beyond an understanding just of science. I mean, and I'm not a scientist, and I used the word scientist in the very last line of my play very deliberately, because the word did not come into use until 1834. It's the first time we have the word scientist in a publication. So it's almost 20 years after the book was written, the first time the word scientist is used. The book has often been described as a handbook of radical philosophy, and one of the reasons I came to it and thought I really want to do this is because I'd never seen, in all the movies and some plays I'd seen, I'd never seen anyone attempt to actually lay out in front of us all the ideas that, as I say, are bubbling out of Mary Shelley. I can't answer the question, why does it have such relevance to so many people? I can only tell you that since we put this play on at the National Theatre of London nearly 6 years ago, there have been different productions of it in places as far apart as Latvia, South Korea, Japan, Canada, Hungary, Poland. There's something about the story which seems to have a very, very broad appeal, and if I could bottle it, I'd be very rich. But I don't know what it is, and as we say in the theatre, you know, if anybody knew what the secret was to making a hit play, we'd all write hit plays all the time. But we don't. So something in this story has a real reach across cultures, across the world, and it's remarkable that, you know, that we're sitting here 200 years after she published it, still wishing to talk about it. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah. I have another question, which is a more theatrical one, a dramaturgical one, if you like. Having made the decision to foreground the creature, that the creature is virtually our hero in this story, there's still the necessity of creating some sort of aesthetic balance between the creature's aspirations and Victor's. And the creature does, those of you that have read the adaptation or the novel, realize that the creature does some horrific things, despite this idea of essential innocence. And what and this is difficult to formulate as a question, but I marveled at the way in which you achieved a kind of balance between these two figures, something that is perhaps mirrored by the fact that, as Rebecca pointed out, that the two actors at the National alternated in performance. That is, one night one would play Victor, the next night the creature. But even though Victor is seen as basically a hollow, sexless intellectual, I think that a good production of this play allows us to feel something for him at the end, even at the very end. And this extraordinary balance, psychological balance, that is achieved must have been extremely difficult, especially where you were coming from with the story. And I'm not sure if that's a great question, but I'd like you to speak to what I'm trying to articulate here.
Excuse me. It's a lot of the decisions that you take trying to make a piece of theatre are based on very practical reasoning. And what Henry's just described is when the director decided that the actors were going to alternate the parts, it then becomes imperative that the part of Victor has to be as good, one hopes, as the part of the creature. Otherwise, they're not going to swap them around. They're just going to say, well, I want to play the good part. The second part's got to be good as well. The second part, Victor, I call it the second because he comes into the story second, he's like running to catch up. We've had an hour, perhaps, of the creature being creature-ish and eventually violent and horrible because he's decided he's going to wreak revenge. He says, "I sweep to my revenge" in my version, which is actually a line from Hamlet. And he becomes...
Which wasn't in his bag of books, was it?
No, it wasn't his bag of books.
He somehow read Hamlet as well.
No. Victor I have to find for him some kind of psychological depth, as you suggest, and I found it in looking at the story from a particular point of view of which I have personal experience, which is autism, for those of you who know anything about it. I have autism in my family. I'm very familiar with it. And this was in part a driving factor in wanting to write this play. It began with seeing the creature as exhibiting many of the traits of autism, for those of you who know something about it, which is you want to join in, but you keep getting it wrong and people don't like you and then they throw stones at you. And then you get cross, and then you get violent and destructive, but you still want to join in. And you keep trying, but you keep getting it wrong, and then they throw stones at you again. And so I sort of began with that thing of leading to a destructive violence through not being assimilated and not being accepted. But then I also started to think about it in terms of Victor's psychology. Because let's not forget, we are talking, I think the novel is talking, and I am also talking about a kind of doppelganger effect. They are a mirror image of each other. Victor is clearly a narcissist, as one of our very bright students said earlier on, having read it. Victor's narcissism leads him to try and to play at God. He wants to play at God, and what does God do? God builds man in his own image. I genuinely think, and believe me, I've been through the paragraph with a bloody microscope trying to work out what Mary Shelley is actually saying. There are about 8 lines in which she describes making this thing. And it's pretty clear to me that what she's suggesting is that Victor thinks he's so wonderful and perfect, he's trying to make another one of him, but he simply hasn't got the technical ability yet, and it comes out a bit monsterish. When he gets a second go at it and builds a female, she's absolutely wonderful. What I decided to do in the latter part of my play, which isn't already in the book at all, to be honest, but it suits my purpose, is to suggest that the creature actually understands love and what it might mean to be in love in a way that Victor can't and doesn't. That Victor is, Henry said sexless. I mean, yes, he is, but you could argue that there's his great friend in the novel, Clerval. You can make a strong case for saying that Victor feels homosexual love for Clerval, which is why he doesn't want to sleep with his wife. I decided to leave that out of my version of the story because I thought it slightly confused what I was trying to do. But you can make a strong case for saying that Victor's in love with Clerval. I think that in what happens at the end, I mean, I'll just, excuse me, going on and on and on, but no. Very quickly, it was incredibly hard to end this story as a stage version. In the book, Walton finds Victor dying on an ice floe, takes him on his ship, Victor dies, and then the creature comes along and Walton goes, oh, it's true, there really was a monster, oh my God, and the monster goes off and we don't really know, but it looks as if he's set his own funeral pyre on an ice floe and probably burnt himself to death. We don't know, we're not told, because Mary Shelley's got no idea either. She's got no idea how to end it. But it ends with them both being dead. And every time, and I wrote the final scene dozens of times with them both dying, and it kind of goes flat, and the whole thing suddenly went, and nobody liked the endings I was coming up with. Until I decided, I got this image in my head of DNA, of the double helix. It goes on forever. It's like a dance. And one of the things that Watson and Crick and the woman who worked with him, whose name I've now forgotten, one of the things they said about when they discovered the double helix of DNA is one of them said, I thought this, or I had this dream about it. I knew it had to be right because it was so beautiful. And I thought I wanted to try and create this sense that they were locked in an unending dance at the end. That one would pursue the other and it would never end. The scientist, the creator, and his experiment were forever locked in a symbiotic relationship they couldn't break out of. So I ended up with them not dying, but sort of going off in this dance. And so we've come to the end of the play, and I think probably the end of my speeches.
Yeah. No, that was a perfect moment to ask for our audience members to come forward and ask any of their own questions of Nick Deere. I would ask that we give first consideration to our students, if that would be okay, since they have done all of this work reading and thinking and talking about this novel. Thank you. Come on up. Yeah.
Looks like they're going to plead the Fifth Amendment.
I have a lot of students out there. I see you.
And she has a grade book here.
Yeah, extra credit. Come on up. Don't be shy. There's so much to talk about. All right.
Bravo.
Yeah.
And you have to endure the walk down the aisle, too.
The gauntlet.
Should I say my name?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gavi. And my question is about coming up with a physical representation of the monster. There's been a lot of different ways that it's been portrayed, and I was wondering how you came up with your version and the reasons behind it.
Thank you. It's a good question.
Did everybody hear the question?
How did we come up
Do we
with
need
that?
to repeat it?
How did we come up with that version of the monster? There's something important to say, first of all, which the students I was talking to earlier have heard this. When you come to do it on the stage, as opposed to in a movie, you're actually working with real live actors, actual people. And they tend to be, very fit, sexy hunks. They don't tend to be 9 foot high with a bolt through their neck. Not that we wanted the bolt through the neck anyway, but in the theatre, as opposed to in the movies, you're working on a human scale, especially if you're doing that switch around with the two actors, and you've got two of them. You're working on a double human scale. So we are not... Well, there's another thing to say. What's my main purpose here? Is it to try and frighten the audience? No, that's so not my purpose. I think there are elements in the story which are frightening, possibly not in what is often described as a Gothic way, though I have reservations about its actual Gothicness. But it's not my purpose. I think the story is chilling if told properly, but I'm not here to put something on the stage which will terrify an audience. When Mary Shelley, 5 years after she published the book, she comes back from Italy. Percy Shelley's drowned. She goes back with her one remaining child, 3 of the earlier ones having died, to live with her father in London in 1823. And within 1 week of being back in England after 8 years in Italy, they go to a theatre to watch a play called Presumption or the Fate of Frankenstein. 5 years after she published it, there were already plays, and I think there were 4 plays done in London that year. Of course, there's no copyright. Nobody has to ask permission. She doesn't get any money from it. Throughout the 19th century, there were versions of Frankenstein in the London theatre. They were all, as far as I can judge, and I'm not an expert, there are many people who know more about this than I do, but they were all primarily there to try and scare the audience. So they wanted a great big scary monster who would terrify the shit out of everybody in the house. That wasn't my purpose. I wanted to see this creature come from, as I say, from an inarticulate babyhood to a highly intellectualized maturity in 2 hours. So it's got to be real. I am trying to answer your question, believe it or not. It's got to be a reality to it. It can't, and it's also a very physical play. They fight, there's a rape, there's all sorts of physicality. So that has enormous implications for what you can do with makeup, particularly with prosthetic makeup. Now, prosthetic makeup has come a long way in the last few years, but particularly in the movies. In the movies, they can do anything. They rip arms off and all that crap they do. But in the theatre, we're working in real time, and you've got to do it every night. And the makeup's got to stay on until the end of the play, and the actor's going to be hot and sweaty and under a lot of lights. And the answer to your question is we experimented for months with makeup. We had a team of makeup people making prosthetics prosthetic, mainly stitching. Oh, the other thing to be said is Danny Boyle took the two actors off to see an autopsy, and I couldn't face it, I'm afraid. I thought, I've done my job, I don't have to sit through an autopsy. Where they actually, took a brain out and all that. And we discussed quite a lot about, although we don't know how you impart life to an inanimate form, we did think about, well, if you were going to try and do that, would you really get a leg from here and an arm from there? No, you wouldn't. You'd get a cadaver and you'd try and put organs back into it that worked. So that means you're not getting something with one arm's 2 feet longer than the other. You're starting, the reality is you just get a body and you try and make it go again. So all of these things do impact on how do you design the monster. Well, I've got at home one of my treasured things on my wall. I asked our designer, Suturat Lalab, who now teaches design at a university here in the United States, and I can't offhand remember which one. I'd have to look it up. Somewhere in the northeast. And I've got her drawings for the stitching, basically. So what we ended up with was an idea that it would just be stitching, but it had to be stitching which wouldn't come off. So it's stuck on. Whichever actor was playing our creature was in makeup for 2 hours before each show every night. And if you look at photos of that National Theatre production, it won't seem particularly horrifying, the makeup. That's for two reasons. One, the practical ones that I've been talking about, and secondly, that was never our purpose, just to be ghoulish and horrifying. Good question.
This is Jacopo from Florence.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Jacopo, and I was really fascinated about that point that you made about the myth of creation, especially from the point of view that we usually create this myth to understand the universe and give answer to some deeper philosophical questions. I was wondering how that plays with the fact that you chose to show us the world from the eyes of something that's artificial and therefore outside of the natural world, and if there is a link to that.
Thank you. I don't know that I can properly answer that question except to say that I think the fact that it is outside the natural world is what distinguishes this creation myth from others. And I think most creation myths, and believe me, I'm so not an expert, I would hazard a guess that most creation myths come about over the course of time from a particular belief system in a particular part of the world that has a need for a creation myth of some kind. Some people have a need for 300 gods, some people have a need for one god. They evolve and develop and probably aren't written or are amassed from, the 40 books of Gospels that probably existed, of which we have 4, This one is significantly different in that it is just the invention of a person's mind. And so I'm being very loose and elastic when I call it a creation myth, because clearly it's not a myth, it's a novel, it's a construct, it's a piece of fiction written by a young woman. And I think you're right to identify that it is about something which is outside of humanity, but that's because it's not genuinely a creation myth at all. That's bullshit, what I was saying.
I'm Gina, and I guess more basic question on the title of the lecture: which one do you think is the monster? If there is.
That's a good question too.
Good question.
I think one of my intentions, which seems to have had some success, was that people would simply ask the question and would end up. My ambition for any play is that the audience go home arguing about it. I love it when people get in the bar and go, no, it was meant to be this, it was meant to be that. And I think it's quite likely that a lot of people will be asking that question, having seen or read my play, which one really is the monster? And I like its ambivalence. I like it being left open. I think if it brings with it some encouragement to look again at Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, from a slightly different perspective, and say, hang on, do we really buy this guy? Are we committed to what he's saying, or should we be a little more dubious about what he's up to? Not necessarily to say that he is a monster, but then on the other hand, Mary Shelley doesn't say that the creature is a monster. So in a sense, both of them are monsters and neither of them monsters, and I can have my cake and eat it.
Well, I think we can now thank...
No, there's one.
Oh, there's one more. Okay, come on down. A couple more. Good. Don't be shy.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello.
My name's Clayton. I'm a resident advisor, so I've been a part of a lot of different discussions with some of my residents.
Okay.
And one of the parallels that we've seen across the board with this piece of fiction is this idea of associating the creature as the other, as just like a general term. And so one of my inquiries at this point is then, how do you, as like a playwright, reconcile perhaps the worldview of Mary Shelley of the other then grieving over the creator in the end? So like, for example, looking at people who are of othered status. A lot of us aren't necessarily grieving over people who have like more social capital or relative power to us. So what do you think that specific ending of the creature who has been in a lot of ways exiled, exploited, subjugated, grieving over their master in its worldview to today?
That's a hard question.
It's a hard question, and I think I do understand what you're saying, and I think if I understand it right, you're saying, why would he grieve for this guy? Would that be right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that if this was a story of some kind of social realism, which was actually set in a world which was real, it would be very, very hard to justify that. But I don't think it is a story of social realism. I think it's a story, as I say, it's a fairy tale for grown-ups in one respect. And I think he is grieving at this point because he says all he ever wanted was a father. Victor has given up on his responsibilities of parenthood. And along with all the other things that are going on in the story, there's that sense of loss. And I can entirely see that you might argue that somebody who has been presented in the story as a slave, as the downtrodden, as the outsider, would not wish to grieve in reality for the death of their oppressor. And you could put it that way. I would say to you, though, that if you were mounting a production of my play, you could make that point. You might choose to completely subvert the lines I've written. The creature could be deeply sarcastic at that moment. You could make it clear to an audience that he's not really grieving at all. All those things are available in the theatre if one chose to do a production of this play. It doesn't have to all be at face value, as it were. I don't think that there's any reason why one should necessarily believe what the creature is saying at that point. I think, from my point of view, it's to do with he wanted his father to love him, and his father didn't love him. But one could see it as a master-slave thing, and that would be a very different way of looking at it. It's an excellent question. I can't really begin to get under the surface of it right here and now, but it's a good thought.
Hello, I'm Anupama. This is loud. And my question was more about your adaptation and why you chose to focus your point of view on to show through the creature's point of view instead of like the book goes through a lot of different point of views. It first starts out with the sea captains, and then Frankensteins, and then there's like a 45 pages in the middle you were talking about. It's interesting that you started out with the innocence of the creature himself, and why you chose to start out with the creature's point of view.
Again, that's a good question. The main reason was I didn't think it had ever been done. I don't think anybody had ever tried to tell, and in all the different versions of the story that had been done, and nobody had ever done it that way around. And I thought, maybe there's some value, maybe there's some currency in trying it that way around. There's another answer, though, which is that I did try to write the sea captain story, the Walton story, and there are some versions of the play in which I put that in. It just didn't work. It just took all the air out of it. You thought, what's this sea captain doing? We've come to watch the story of Frankenstein and his monster. Why do we want a sea captain? And then you've got to have sailors running up rigging and going, oh, captain, I spy somebody on an ice floe. And before you know it, you're off on a different play altogether, and probably a much longer one, which takes a lot more resources. And particularly in discussion with my director, he said, I just don't like that. I just think that takes the story somewhere else, and I just want to get as fast as possible into this central story of the scientist and his experiment. So I dumped it. I mean, there are many different versions of the story that I've tried, and all I can say is the one I've ended up with is the one that I felt was strongest.
Hi, I'm Kirtanya, and my question is about the women characters in the play. I found it kind of interesting that being the daughter of a feminist like Mary Wollstonecraft, the women in Mary Shelley's book were kind of flat and just wanted to be these perfect housewives. Was that an intentional comment on the women of that age, or am I reading too much into it?
Again, it's an excellent question. I don't think it's an intentional comment in that way. I just think that if one looks closely at the book, as I had to, the women are not at the centre of the story. There've been, as I said before, there've been many attempts to make Elizabeth into a feisty, proto-feminist. Just to me, it just doesn't work. It unbalances the story. I've written lots of things where it's been really important to me to try and make good, strong, central female characters. In this one, though, to me, what was essential was that the central battle was between, as I keep saying, the scientist and his experiment. And to me, all the other characters are pretty much peripheral. Mary Shelley's not great at writing secondary characters. As I was working on the play, my son, who was then 18, was doing his school exams at 18 in England, and he said, Dad, I'm doing Frankenstein. I've got to write an essay on the Justine subplot. What have you got to say about that? I said, I've cut it. I don't understand a word of it. I have no idea why it's there. The simple answer to your question is I didn't find them very interesting, and it's not for want of trying. If I would have loved it if I could have found the female characters more interesting. Mary Shelley, though, there are no mothers in this story. She's lost her mother, as we know, 11 days old. There are no mothers. The story is entirely about fathers and sons, and the female characters are peripheral, and I'm afraid that's inescapable. And I felt that to try and alter that would actually be not trying to do something in the spirit of what I thought Mary Shelley was up to, but another one of these bastardized adaptations.
It's true.
One more?
Okay.
One more? Sure. One more.
Yeah.
My name is Bob Duffy. I asked Professor Messbarger this question rather facetiously, but the more I've heard what you're doing today, or you're talking about today, and given leave to ask a bad question by my friend Henry, my question is, given the unconscious desire to create humanity, do you not think that there's a similar desire to create monsters and to move that into the political realm? Do you not think that the electorate, when it gets angry enough and forms a mob that is out with everything except the pitchforks, do you think that we create our own living, political, horrible, evil monsters time and time again, and especially now?
Well, I don't think just especially now. I think throughout history we've done so. We have this propensity. Every once in a while we throw up a really awful monster. We've got a few of them at the moment, but usually there's a few of them. I have to say, I don't think that was really on Mary Shelley's agenda.
Right.
I don't think she's really got that kind of a political angle going on in this book. Even though I said it's very influenced by the ideals of the French Revolution, which I think it is, I don't think she has, particularly perhaps because she's only 18, 19 years old, I don't think she's really got much to say about politics or about political evil in the world. One can infer that, certainly, from her creation, but I don't think it's her intention.
Well, her intentions aside, one thing that that art offers us a chance to do is to move it off the literal page and into the public sphere.
Of course.
And I think that in that way, I've thought about it a lot, that, this monster amongst us looks a lot like.
But then one is led to say, is Hitler as evil as he is because he was treated badly as a child? And the answer is almost certainly no. It's not. If you take the model of Frankenstein and try and apply it to political evil, I think you come unstuck quite fast. I think political evil probably comes from somewhere slightly other. I think Mary Shelley's evil monster looks simplistic compared to our political monsters today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.